This talk is going to be a bit disconnected. It's going to split into two sections. First of which will be a presentation, and the second will be a film which you could rather consider as a sort of video on demand section. So it's not really necessarily tied to what I'm going to say. There's going to be, I'm going to try to make a connection, but it's a bit lame, so don't really take it so seriously. But I wanted today to use rather what I would call a footnote of production. In order to, it's an anecdote, it's something which I went through in the production of one of my last films, in order to think about what I would consider a radical transformation of the function of archives in the light of recent technological changes and also processes of globalization. And it's really a very minor and modest story, but maybe something could be, made visible, which really relates to this transformation of archive. So the whole talk is about a picture which I did not include in one of my films, although I wanted to. And it's about the search for this picture, which is a take from a film. I will explain very briefly what sort of film it is, but you can have a look at it. This is a still from this take in question, and it will immediately become clear to you why it was impossible to include it in a film. Because, as you can see, both sides of the images have been cropped so that all relevant information is missing. You see neither the words which the person has written on the blackboard nor the person itself. All that is left is some sort of vague, indeterminate picture in between. And as I wanted to really include this picture, I was looking for a more complete version of this picture, and this research is what I think is interesting. I never found the picture, but the research became much more interesting than the picture itself. Just very briefly to give you an idea about where this picture is from. It's part of a Yugoslav partisan movie called The Battle of Neretva, which was produced in 1969, and it was a huge blockbuster at that time, a huge action movie, which was for a long time the most expensive Eastern European film production. It starred people like Orson Welles, Yul Brynner, Kurt Jürgens, lots of famous Yugoslav actors, Franco Nero, and so on. And it was a very popular film, and the scene to which this take belongs is a scene which shows the liberated partisan territories before they are being devastated by a German air raid, and there's a teacher who is writing some words on a blackboard, and these words spell out AVNOI, which says something like Anti-Fascist Liberation Council of the former Yugoslavia, and she reads out that word. I will show you the scene briefly later. And it's a very short scene, it's not very significant, but I wanted to quote it. The first time I saw this picture, or at least, the only time I saw the complete picture was actually in the Film Museum in Sarajevo. We came there at a point where it wasn't officially open, and this film was screening there in an empty cinema, which made a very weird impression, but actually it turned out that this was part of the preservation strategy of this archive. They would screen every print once a year in order to ventilate it, as the projectionist put it, and thus preserve it. So this already says something about the conditions under which this archive is functioning. I will just very briefly show you the scene I'm talking about. As I said, it's not very exceptional. Sound, please. Sound. Can we have some sound on this clip?
Yes, he's working. He's working.
Je. A sada, djeco, čitajte naglas. AVNOI. AVNOI.
So you see the part where she is actually saying this line, AVNOI, is off screen. And this is the reason why I wanted to find a more complete version, but actually the more I was looking for it and the more I failed to find it, I realized that this off-screen part was actually not something which had come about by mistake or sheer misfortune, but it was a space which was very precisely determined by political and economical factors. The first one being, for example, the circumstance under which I received this picture, because this picture is a VHS I was given by the Sarajevo Film Museum. And because they are lacking funds, they are sort of taping their own collection or privatizing their own collection in order to rent it out and to sell VHS copies. The only problem is that the way they are doing is they are simply pointing an old VHS camera at the screen. And the format is obviously 4:3. And the original format of the film is obviously widescreen, so if you transfer it like this, then you will lose at least half of the image information. And this maybe throws first light on this topic of the politics of archives that I wanted to mention, because this is already, I think, a displacement of what I would consider as traditional politics of the archive. Because the archive, the minimum you would expect from an archive like a film museum, is that it tries to reproduce its own material, the items it stores, as faithfully as possible, in brackets, as identical as possible. And keeping the control over the reproduction of its own items is one of the main pillars on which the authority of an archive rests in general.